Alright guys, Willem here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with part 2 of my ranking of every Big Brother player, where here we'll be running through spots 240 through 161, the next 80 people on the list, where we're getting out of the absolutely terrible players to the still very bad players. So let's continue on with the list. At number 240, we're moving on to a player that was seemingly a very emotional player and didn't really have much agency in the game, and that person is Brittany from BB23, who again, it was simply just not really in any core alliance throughout really the entire season. I mean, despite her allies and Azah and Big D being in the cookout, they really didn't do much to really help her game through doing so, and she was simply just this expendable number that was constantly used on the block, and she would get emotional over why people were putting her on the block. And again, she really didn't do that much on the season. Now, I do think she got a little bit screwed over in how she went out, and the fact that the twist put a bigger target on her back, but still not a particularly good player, a very emotional one, because that for me, she's here at 240. 239, another player that I don't feel like did that much in the game. I feel like this person was at least a bit safer throughout more of the game, and that person is Will from BB14, who again was kind of just there. I don't know how much he was actively playing. It really just felt like he was trying to be social, trying to be likable, and again, it got him to almost the jury phase of the game. But another one of these players that again was just kind of expendable, not really part of any major alliance. He kind of just followed along with whatever Janelle's team was doing early on, and then once we got to the individual portion of the game, again, he lets Janelle go, only to be the immediate target after that. Again, there's not really much to truly praise from Will's game, but again, I do think he was relatively safe early on, at least. Unlike Brittany, who was constantly used as a pawn, I feel like Will, at least, again, was likable and was relatively liked by the cast. Well, I don't think he had much strategically going on. Do have him here at number 239. Now at 238, we're kind of starting this tier here of players that were taken out despite being a pawn and had relatively close votes. And here we're starting it off at 238 with Cheryl from BB2, the first pawn to ever go home. And Cheryl is a player that I think is kind of interesting in the sense that she did seem to be very well liked by the cast. It very much felt like she was taken out simply because she was looked at as a pawn, and going along with the Nicole vote was looked at as supporting Chilltown, which people didn't want to do. So I think in that light, I do think Cheryl got massively screwed over, as I think whoever was against Nicole on the block probably would have gone home. But again, Cheryl was pretty good socially. Again, people did like her. Really, people from both sides. Now, again, she was left out of the strategic talks in the game because she was the pawn that was going home. But again, she had a good bond with Monica even despite that. And I think Cheryl's a player that probably had some potential, though we'll never truly see it. But I did feel like that potential was enough to put her here at number 238. Number 237, we're moving on to a player that I don't think is particularly good, but they did come pretty close to staying and did get kind of screwed over in their boot round. And that person is Bronte from BB18. And again, Bronte is a similar case where she was a pawn on the block. She does go home in an extremely close vote. However, she wasn't even going home until literally the night before the eviction, where it did seem like Tiffany was the very easy target. Bronte was simply the pawn, and things were going pretty smoothly until the vote flipped at the last second, essentially as a screw you to Frank, which also brings us to the point where, again, Bronte was really screwed over by the fact that Frank was even able to nominate her to begin with, where, again, that was obviously due to the roadkill challenge, and had that not been in the game, again, she would have been safe. I mean, she literally gets taken out during her closest ally's HOH, and again, Bronte, I do think, is someone that gets screwed over in that light. However, I think just as a player outside that, she wasn't particularly good. I mean, while she did have her core set of allies and Bridget and Natalie, and even beyond that, still had the likes of Jose and Victor and Paul early on. I mean, Bronte still was not particularly good, which is again looked at as a pretty expendable person, which is why she ends up going home in the way she does. But I think the fact that she gets so screwed over on her way out is enough to put her here at 237. Number 236, similar thing. Don't know how good of a player this person is, but I think the way that they go out is pretty unlucky, and that person is Kara Monaco from BB14, who, again, I think it's very unlucky in the fact that she was on Dan's team in a position where Willie really just wanted to target Dan or Boogie's teams and essentially nominated their two strongest players, which, again, I do think massively screwed over Kara, along the fact that this is another situation where, again, she was pretty safe for a lot of the week. It wasn't until Frank really led this charge against Willie that the vote ultimately flipped on her. And again, it's not one of these situations where she's not really getting taken out because they want her out necessarily. It's more so to make a statement against Willie. So again, it's a very similar case to the last few people. I think the reason why I have her above the last few people is I think she's probably the player I would have the most confidence in. I do feel like she seemed to know the game decently well and did seem like a mostly affable person to where, again, a lot of the cast liked her. It's just that, again, the overall dynamics and twist didn't really work to her favor to where, again, I think if she were to play again, I think she could do very well. But again, on this appearance, wasn't the greatest. So because of that, for me, she's here at 236. Now 235, we're moving on to a very actively bad player, one that commonly gets called as one of the worst players of all time. However, I do think there is some acumen to this player, and that person is Lawan for BB13. And obviously Lawan made a really idiotic move in telling the entire house to evict him under the pretense of him thinking that he would get some sort of superpower. However, I will say, again, like, he doesn't do that if it wasn't for the fact that production not told them that there would be a twist in the following round, where obviously that information very much allows Lawan to really run circles with that causes him to eventually volunteer to go up. But beyond that, again, like, he was really safe in the game had he not done that. Again, no one was coming for Lawan. Obviously, he was on the side of like Kalia and Danielle, and they were bigger targets than him. Or obviously, they wanted to keep him safe as well. Where again, had he not done it to himself, he was a pretty safe player in the game, along with the fact that he also was pretty well liked in the house. I mean, he pretty much got along with everybody. I mean, that's kind of why he was the one of the regulators to actually squeeze on by and not be initially targeted after the rest left. And again, I think there is some good to Lawan's game. But again, there's some actively bad stuff there as well. Where for me, he does land here at 235. At 234, moving on to a player that I really didn't know what to do with. I found this player to be kind of an enigma through my watches of their run. However, at 234, I do have Angie from BB10. And again, Angie has a game that I think is a bit strange. I mean, she does end up becoming close to Brian early on and is kind of lumped in with him to where once he's evicted, she's kind of considered like one of these potential targets for being associated to Brian, but she does avoid that target in week 2, seemingly due to the fact that she was pretty close to Jesse, which does lead to Steven going out in week 2. However, she obviously proceeds to get targeted in week 3 and eventually goes out. However, seemed to actually have a good core group by that point, seemingly finding herself within the Jesse, Memphis, Michelle group to where, again, I think that does at least show some acumen there. The fact that, again, she was on the outs at one point and then found herself in a somewhat sizable alliance. Now, again, she still loses day by the end of it and does go out pretty unceremoniously, but I think there's some like minorly impressive things to talk about for her. But obviously the ideal would just her not being in the bottom to begin with, and even then it still felt like a good chunk of the house were going to target her. And even then, again, it felt like a good chunk of the house never really looked at her as someone they were wanting to work with long term, to where, again, I don't really feel like she had many prospects moving forward. But again, at least there's something to give her some credit for. So for me, she's at 234. Now 233, we have a player that I think got pretty unfortunate with how the season played out. I think there is a decent player within this person, but we just never really got to see it. And that person is Cassie from BB13, where, again, I think she got very unfortunate in the fact that she was on a cast of Rachel Riley, who just hated her from the offset, where really, I mean, like, Cassie seems like a pretty well-rounded player. I mean, one that seemingly was decent socially, someone that was competent in challenges, while also someone that, again, like, wasn't an idiot. So again, I feel like Cassie's someone that if she were to play again, which will never happen, I think there is a way that she could be a competent player, particularly with the fact that, again, she had a core group in the regulators, even though they didn't go so well. But again, part of the reason why they didn't go so well is because there was this essentially fans versus favorites twist, where the vets ended up gaining power very early on. And again, at least she was one of these people that tried to do something about it. She also had like a really close relationship with Shelly. She also was able to build a really strong bond with Jeff and Jordan, to where they really did not want to target her, to where really it seems like she goes out simply just because Dominic won the veto, where had that not been the case, then Cassie would have survived another round. And I mean, to be fair, based on how comps play out, she probably just goes home the following week anyway. But I think she gets pretty unfortunate in the actual round that she goes home. And I think it also gets pretty unlucky with the fact that she's in this portion of the game that has these pairs going up together, where I think had that not been the case, there's a serious chance that Cassie does survive the block as well. So where again, I think there's a lot of unlucky circumstances surrounding Cassie, along with the fact that this is just simply not a cast that was really suited towards her. To where again, I do see some potential in her to where she's here at number 233. Now at 232, we're moving on to a player that I don't look at as a particularly good player of the game, but I think they were someone that, again, had a core group at a point, and I think it's pretty unfortunate due to their connection to another player, and that person is Sarah from BB6. And again, Sarah is someone that is probably too kind-hearted for the game. I don't think there really was any killer instinct in her. She just simply seemed to be someone that was just really sweet, and I don't know how much game there was really going on. However, Sarah was someone that I think had she been in the game without James, she could have been in a somewhat decent spot. I mean, she was pretty affable to the entire house. Everyone pretty much liked her and didn't want her to go, and felt bad that she was essentially taking the fall for James. To where again, like, she ends up going home essentially because they need to split up James and Sarah, more so than Sarah doing much wrong on her own right. Also, the fact that if she goes out from her own allies HOH, which, I mean, to be fair, that's probably her fault, or at least partially her fault, but still, I mean, like, it all kind of stems back to James and the threat level that James had in the game. Where again, I think Sarah was a mostly affable person outside that, and like early on was never in danger. By the time of week 3, I mean, she's the one, she recognized that she needs to go along with the Sovereigns and helps get James on board, and again, at least had a core group for a week. At least that's something. To where again, I think Sarah at least had some potential, to where she had some pretty bad circumstances happen to her, to where again, for me, she ends up landing here at 232. Now 231, kind of similar thing, but for a player that was booted much earlier in the game, but I think probably had more prospects long term, and that person is Lori from BB5. And Lori is a player that I think, as a whole, again, I think her issue is the fact that she just really didn't have the drive to play the game. However, I think she was actually kind of skilled at the game, pretty good at challenges, while also being really good socially, to where just so many people gravitated around her, to where despite the fact that she had this massive target on her back from taking $10,000 at the very beginning of the season, she still was able to essentially have half the house fully loyal to her. I mean, she had really strong bonds with the likes of Will and Karen and Diane and Akomis, to where that was such a solid group early on, to where despite her being targeted by Marvin, she almost gets out of that, where had the nomination stayed the same, Holly goes home that week, and at that point she's in this pretty strong spot moving forward, especially considering how the comps play out. But I think she just got super unfortunate, the fact that Jace ends up winning the veto and kind of ends up ruining all their plans. But again, Lori was pretty close to being in a really strong position in the game. My issue with Lori as a whole, though, is that I don't really know how much strategy there is from Lori herself, where while again she was very good socially, I think she was also really mediocre strategically, to where again, like, I don't think there really was much strategy to her game. It was simply her latching off the strategy of her allies. And again, she also wanted to quit the game in week 2 before she ends up deciding she wants to stay, and then tries in the veto, and even then, even if she won the veto, she was not going to use it, which is also a questionable choice. So again, like, I do feel like Lori definitely has some questionable aspects to her game, but I do think is actually a pretty solid player, particularly in the social department, to where for me she's here at 231. Now at 230, we're moving on to a player that I always found to be an interesting player, considering how early of a player this was. Someone that I think had some level of dynamicism to their game, but also just played the game all wrong, and that person is Kent from BB2. And again, to me, Kent is a player that was hyper strategic in the game. I think he is someone that is playing the game very hard, and someone that is wheeling and dealing in the game. The problem is I think he does it too much, and we do get to his HOH reign, where he really just goes on this massive power trip during that week, to where it really just turns off the majority of the house against him, to where he's the immediate target for the following week, to where he obviously plays their game really poorly at that point. But again, there was at least like some glimmers of him being a somewhat decent player. I mean, early on he was part of top. He had good relationships with like Hardy and Nicole and obviously Bunky, but I just feel like he's the type of player that would never particularly do well in Big Brother. I think, considering I feel like he's always going to either be an early boot due to his aggressive gameplay style and him not really gelling in, or he'll be taken along as a GOAT. But even then, I think that likelihood is even less likely, considering just how much he will over strategize in the game. I really just don't feel like Kent is someone that really would have much potential in any given season. So that's why he's here at number 230. Number 229, moving on to a player that is one of the most hateable people in Big Brother history. And while their game wasn't good, I feel like there's at least something to give him credit for, and that is Daniel Durston from BB24. And again, as a person, Daniel kind of sucks, but I think as a player, while there are things to criticize for sure, the fact that he didn't make the most of his HOH reign, I at least feel like there's at least some justification for that, and the fact that obviously they had just come from watching Frenchie playing as terribly as he did his first HOH, to where I do think Daniel was cautious because of that. And obviously Daniel is just a dick, to where that becomes a major reason why he's eventually taken out in the spot he is. Though, again, like, I think the thing for Daniel is that he is a fan of the game. He does know the game pretty well, and there are points where he does have pretty decent reads on the game. I mean, outside the fact that he does backdoor his own closest ally, again, he seemed to be aware of the leftovers and was able to clock their alliance. He at least was trying really hard to organize the people below him, to where, again, like, I think there is some game acumen there. Again, obviously the problem is the fact that he just simply was just kind of an asshole. So because of that, for me, he is here, number 229. Number 228, moving on to another player that wasn't particularly great in the house, but someone that did demonstrate some game acumen. That person is Josh from BB3. And Josh, to me, is, again, not a particularly likable presence, and one that did come off as very annoying even to the other house guests, but someone that, again, like, showed some game acumen. I mean, for a time at BB3, he was a very dynamic player. I mean, he was one that was making deals constantly, and despite his personality conflicts with Marcellus in particular, he still gets saved in week 2. He had the likes of Eric and Roddy being extremely loyal to him. Also had like a bond with Danielle. And again, like, he had stuff going on in the game. Problem is, again, his very abrasive personality, to where, again, it didn't really gel with most people. And then really his final week is just kind of pathetic, to where the fact that Kiara, one of his own allies, goes after him in a spot where they don't have many other allies left is a really bad spot there. And while it's obviously indicative of Kiara's poor play, which we'll talk about, it's also indicative of how much Josh annoyed people, where, again, Josh is definitely not a good player, but I think there's at least points where he does show some decent game acumen that leaves him here at number 228. Now, at 227, I believe we have our first two-time player, another player that, again, showed some potential at points, but overall not a good player, and that person is Jace Wiry from BB5 and All-Stars. And again, I think Jace is a player that definitely knows the game. I mean, he is someone that can talk articulately about the game, but he obviously has 2 runs in the show, both being pre-jury. His first run in particular is really bad from a gameplay front. I mean, while he's a fantastic character, I mean, he instantly makes a massive target of himself, and while his allies win the early HOHs, he still really fails to get any of his way during those weeks, where obviously Holly ends up getting taken out in week 3, which is something so detrimental to him. And then from that point on, he's in this spot where he has to win out, where he wins the veto in week 4 and then is proceeded to be backdoored in week 5. And again, it's a terrible game on BB5. And then his BB7 game is one where, again, I thought he repaired his game early on, where it did seem like he was doing decent work and working with level 6 and trying to float in the middle. But then obviously all that gets blown up by week 3, where he gets exposed, and mixing that with the fact that he is this big threat in the game, he ends up getting sniped out there, to where, again, like, Jace obviously just has this issue with threat management, and is also not the greatest social player, to where, again, like, he is obviously a very good competitor, and again, I think strategically at least, like, has some decent game knowledge, but he's never able to really execute on that. Because that, for me, is here number 227. Now 226, moving on to a player that I think is actually really bad, but for some reason they were able to get their way at points. I think it feels fitting that this person's just one spot above Jace, and that person is Scott from BB5. And again, Scott is this weird enigma of a player in the sense that he does what is seemingly wrong constantly, in the fact that he, again, is obviously part of the Horsemen and acts super cocky around the house, treats people terribly, yet despite that, people liked him and people wanted him to stay, and like were upset that they had to vote him out over Marvin, like, because they obviously had to split up him and Jace, which is, again, strange considering how poorly he treated people. But beyond that, again, like, he actually was a pretty central figure within the Four Horsemen. I mean, he was pretty much the person holding that group together, having the closest one-on-one bonds with each member of that group. And it's not a coincidence that once he leaves, that entire group completely fractures. But beyond that, he's also pretty much the main strategist for that group as well, and the one that goes out and tries to execute their plans. Or again, I think Scott has some game acumen for sure. The problem is, again, just the fact that he's Scott. But I think in comparison to Jace, again, I do look at Scott as the better player of the two, where really, had it not been for Jace's BB7 run, he would actually be lower on this list. But still, don't look at Scott as a particularly good player, because that for me is here at 226. Now, 225, we're moving on to a player that I don't look as particularly good either, but I think this person's at least a bit more affable than the likes of Chase and Scott. And that person is Jeff Weldon from BB17, who's probably one of the most dull players in Big Brother history, but his game was actually like not that bad. I mean, he was simply just outplayed by the likes of Vanessa on his boot round, where, again, he did have good connections in the house. He was pretty close to like the James and the Megs and the Jackies of the world, while also having connections to the Nolan twins. And again, like socially, he was actually like not that bad. And mixing that with the fact that, again, he gets backdoored from the game in a spot where I don't feel like many people were actually coming for Jeff. For again, he just seems like a pretty baseline player, one that had BB17 not been as hyper strategic as it was. I do feel like there's definitely a serious chance that he just skates on by much further in the game, though really outside of his social connections and not really much to really praise from his game. And because that for me is here at number 225. Now 224, we're moving back to some posters. This one being higher on the list than my worst players to make the jury, but this is still a really bad player, and that person is Big D from BB23, the first finalist we have on the list. And straight up, Big D doesn't really bring much to the table. I think Big D's really this high simply just because, again, he was a finalist. He at least made the final two, but even then, he barely did. He simply did because he was in the cookout, where had the cookout not exist on that season, he probably gets booted mid-game. Simply as someone that, again, like some people had personality conflicts with. He also was someone that, again, like was pretty expendable had he not been in the cookout. He was also a pretty big wild card of a player that would just change his mind on the whim, while also be under the false assumption that he's running the game, and through that come off as delusional in his game. So again, Big D really didn't do much on the season outside of just burn relationship after relationship on their way out, while also never gaining any true credibility in the game, with him not really doing much in the game. Or again, mixing that with the fact that, again, like he just simply would not make it to the end had not been for the cookout, I feel pretty good in leaving him behind relatively low on the list here, especially for a finalist at number 224. Now 223, moving on to a player that is also pretty bad, but at least they showed some potential at a point, and that person is David Alexander from BB21. And again, David is someone that, like, his first run, obviously, like, while he gets taken out and sniped out due to a competition, when he was in Camp Comeback, he seemed like he was a somewhat competent player. It seemed like he recognized the social dynamics of the house and was calling them out, and again, that was cool. But then he returns and just plays terribly on All-Stars, where we'll give him some credit for the fact that he still makes it all the way to Final 8 in a spot where even then, I mean, the vote to save him was very close there. He also is somehow able to skate his way through the game despite having Memphis directly coming for him for most of that, and is able to be the last of the non-committee / Enzo players in the game. So I think there's like something to give him some credit for, but really, obviously, he didn't play particularly well on that season, had pretty terrible reads, pushed away people that were supposed to be his allies. So again, like a really bad game, but again, at least there was some potential at points, so he's here at 223. Number 222, a player that I think is also really bad and was pretty much a dead man walking for most of the season, but again, there's at least minor things to prop them up for, and that person is Jerry from BB3. And Jerry from BB3, again, I think overall plays a pretty terrible game. I mean, from week one, he wins the veto and decides to use it on Marcellus in a spot where it just blows all of his social capital in the game. And to be fair, I mean, he was already in a spot where, while lumped into the initial majority alliance, he was not being included in that for much further than that, to where I don't think it's incorrect of him to eventually make a move, but for that move to be using the veto on Marcellus and constantly preach about how he's doing it because he's a good person, I think is definitely not the approach to take, with it just causing everyone to be pissed off at him, both from the fact that he's essentially calling them bad people, but also the fact that he just completely ruined their plans. And really, it makes Jerry this big target in the game moving forward. So again, he's pretty much a dead man walking at that point, with no real chance of winning the game especially, but also no real chance of even making it to the end, where while he does get saved in week 2 by Marcellus's HOH, like from that point on, he's really just skating on by through people just like offering 1 week of safety because they know he's a social pariah for the following week. And again, overall, it's a bad game, but the thing I will give him credit for, and the reason why he's as high as he is because at least he makes the move against Eric. At least he does use his HOH to actually make a pretty big move in the game and upsetting the power structure there. So again, at least there's that, but overall, still a pretty bad player. He's here at number 222. Number 221, another player that is pretty unlikable. I mean, like Daniel Durston, one of the least likable players in the history of the show, but as a player, I do have him at 221. That person is Terrence from BB24. And again, not going to say anything good about Terrence as a person, but as a player, I mean, he's also still pretty bad. Very rarely involved in any true power structure, to where while he did have this bond with Nicole and Daniel early on that kept him somewhat in the loop, along the fact that, again, he just seemed to be looked at as this pawn that could be dragged through the game. He also is someone that won an HOH and actually made a pretty big move with that HOH and taking out Joseph, which, I mean, to be fair, he was only allowed to do through the split house twist. But again, it was a move that actually put him in a pretty good spot moving forward. For had it not been for the Kyle situation, which really just unraveled that entire alliance, Terrence is actually probably in a decent spot to make it to the end. Now, again, was he going to win? No. But I do think he's someone that kind of at the end of the day gets screwed over due to a very bizarre circumstance. And again, was at least someone that was willing to make a move. So that's something. But really, the rest of his game is pretty mediocre. So he's here at number 221. And number 220, we have another returning player, a player that sadly played terribly on both of his appearances. And that person is Frank from BB 14 and 18. To where, I mean, Frank's first run obviously is very bad, to where he is a target the entire time, having to win a comp or just barely squeezing by on the block literally every single round. So again, he is the initial target in week 1 and is able to be saved due to Willie really blowing up his game. He's the second HOH, only then be targeted in week 3 and be saved due to the coach's twist coming into play, and then proceeds to be on the block the following week where he's dead to rights until they decide to backdoor Janelle. He then wins HOH and does nothing with that, only then be targeted the following week but win the veto, and then proceeds to win the veto again during the double, only to then win the HOH and fail to take out his target in Dan due to Dan's funeral, and then proceeds to be taken out the following week. Again, it's a terrible game there, one where he burned so many relationships along the way, to where despite the fact that it was impressive that he won as many comps as he did, it probably still would be a tough road for him to win just due to the fact that he burned so many relationships in the house. It still wasn't even a guarantee that he would win even if he somehow got to the end of the game just due to how many relationships he burnt along the way. Then we get to BB 18 where it seemed like he was actually playing better at first. Again, initially he was pretty much running the game alongside the other vets, and then everything just crumbles with his targeting of Dave Vaughn and his targeting of Tiffany and him just coming off too domineering. That again just leads to him being taken out once again. With, again, like, Frank is a player, I think there is like some potential there, and the fact that, again, he is a big fan of the game and clearly knows the game, but just fails whenever he tries to actually play the game, which is something that's really frustrating about him as a player, which is why for me he's here number 220. Number 219, essentially the more modern version of Frank, we have Cameron for BB25. And I think Cameron is essentially Frank 2.0. He is another person that had to win comps or was on the block literally every single week. I mean, he doesn't get through a single round of gameplay without some level of immunity or being on the block. Again, week 1, he was safe from initial noms due to the twist. Weeks 2 and 3, he was on the block. Week 4, he was HOH. Week 5, he won the veto despite being the target. Week 6, he won the HOH again, which, by the way, throughout the entire stretch there, he was the number 1 target for the majority of the house. With him getting evicted by week 7, only for him to come back to the zombie twist to where he wins HOH and then proceeds to get taken out the following week. Again, it's a very bad track record, but I think there is like minor things to give Cameron credit for along the way. I mean, the fact that he does eventually get Izzy out, some of it due to his own work, which again is good, even though he made terrible noms to get that done to begin with and had to really go so far out of his way to get Izzy out by the time she does go out. Along the fact that, again, I think he does pretty good work during zombie week and pulling Matt and Jag back onto his side, and it did seem like coming into that following round he actually didn't need to win HOH, though he does, and that ends up putting the target even further on his back. But again, like, I do think there are some like decent things that Cameron does. I mean, Cameron is again a fan of the show. He clearly knows the show, but again was terrible socially and was also just kind of a creepy person, where again I don't feel like he would have won the season even if he got to the end. I guess I'll briefly mention his Reindeer Games game, which, I mean, to be fair, there isn't that much to really get from Cameron in particular, to where he obviously was the first boot, but he was the first boot because he had no connections to the others. He was kind of the easy man out, and really there isn't much to truly fault him for there. But again, what I will fault him for is everything he did on BB25, where obviously he just simply isn't that good of a player, and because of that, for me, he is here number 219. Number 218, moving on to a player that also made a pretty deep run in the game, but another player that I don't look at as particularly good, and that person is Scotty from BB20. And one thing I will give Scotty for is the fact that he does make a big move in week 3. He does stick to his guns, despite people telling him not to, and targeting Brett and Winston, which was a move that was for his best interest at that point. But even within that, I mean, he targets Brett and doesn't get Brett out, which is an issue. And really, the rest of his game is just pretty bad, to where, well, again, initially he was doing some decent work in getting in the good graces of the Falte Alliance and was looked at as a part of them early on. He then is not trusted at all by the time of week 2, to where his eventual vote for Swaggy just puts an even bigger bullseye on his back. And really from that point on, he's just kind of skating in the game to where no one really trusts him. And while he is loyal to the Falte side of the house, they simply just don't really believe him. And we get to his eviction week where he's essentially evicted by one of his only allies in the game in Fessy, to where Fessy doesn't believe that he was with him the entire time, which is all really bad. And then he ends up getting voted out, comes back into the game, only to then be taken out immediately following that. Again, like, Scotty's game's really bad in my mind. I don't look at him as a particularly good player. I mean, he's not one that, again, knows the game, but again, he did just so much to turn people away from him, while also having no real awareness of his game, to where, again, he thought he was super close to Tyler the entire time, and that him and Tyler were a duo. Well, in reality, Tyler never wanted to work with him the entire time. So I don't think Scotty played a particularly good game, but again, at least he made one big move. So because he's here at number 218. Number 217, we're moving on to a player that was another one that was not really trusted in the game, was kind of on the bottom for a lot of the game, but I think this person demonstrates some potential in the game. And that person is Jesse Kowalski from BB15. And Jesse is another one of these players that, again, like, was just kind of on the bottom, was kind of just skating by, was left safe just due to the fact that there were bigger targets than her, but gets taken out pretty unceremoniously in the early jury phase of the game. But it's someone that, again, like, I think is someone that can shake things up. I mean, she tried to go after the likes of Amanda by the end of her run, and she was someone that, again, was very self-interested. I mean, she does end up playing a pretty individualistic game and did seem to have a bit of a killer instinct to where she was willing to cut people when she needed to. It's just that she was never in a true power position to really do much about that. And I think considering the fact that she was never really grouped into any, like, true major alliance, and makes it as far as she does, well, again, demonstrating some potential in the game, it does make me think that Jessie is someone that could do well if she were to return, but again, it will never happen. But for me on this list, it's enough to put her at number 217. Number 216, moving on to a player that I just think was never really given a fair shake in the game. While this person, again, is probably not that good of a player in the grand scheme of things anyway, I do feel like I'm putting them this high simply because, again, I didn't feel like they had much of a chance on their season, and that person is Candace from BB15. And Candace is a player that, straight up, again, like, I don't think is actually that good of a player. I mean, we do see her very early on just kind of being left on the outs of what's actually going on, her not even being looped in on the David vote, which is pretty bad, but did still seem to have good connections, the likes of Helen and Alyssa. But in reality, again, like, it wasn't really someone that had much traction in the game to begin with. But obviously a lot of her game ends up being soured by the fact that there's a lot of blatant racism in the house, specifically targeted towards her. And really from the Bedit flipping incident in week 3 on, she really just has absolutely no social capital in the game, to where she instantly gets lumped in with Howard and they become targets in the following rounds. And eventually she's taken out pretty unceremoniously by Gina Marie, which is, again, just a bad look. And it's like her run is one that, again, is definitely one that was plagued by racism, to where it's very tough to assess her, like, later game. So, like, again, straight up, I don't look at her as that good of a player, even despite that. But again, it's the fact that she had this very abnormal run in the game, one where, again, she wasn't really given the opportunity to truly play the game due to these other outside the game situations that were affecting her. That obviously would make it tough to play the game in that sort of environment. Like, I think that is enough grace that I'm giving her to where I do have her here number 216. Now number 215, another player that I think was kind of a bit screwed over by some prejudices, and that person ends up being Dominique from BB19. And Dominique also, I think, faced some their biases while in the house, but outside of that, in comparison to Candace, I think is actually a competent player. I mean, I think Dominique is someone that, again, was initially in the core majority alliance. I mean, she was in Paul's alliance, where, again, it seemed like they were going to be running the game. She seemingly gets targeted due to the fact that she had a talk show to where Paul was under the impression that she was using this to gain information on other people, which made them target her. And I mean, along with the fact that, again, other people didn't trust her and looked at her as a duo with Mark, to where it does feel like Dominique got a bit unlucky in the game, to where these, like, as a whole, just feel like very minor reasons of why you would even want her out to begin with. And for that to just lead to the entire house flipping on her and her going out unanimously is kind of ridiculous, especially when they had someone like Jessica still to get rid of. But again, I do think Dominique did show some game ability while she was there. Again, getting herself in the majority alliance, building the strong bond with Mark to where they wanted to be this secret duo, even though they weren't that secret. Again, there was some game ability there, but still at the end of the day, didn't really get to demonstrate much of that. But again, I do think there were some aspects of biases playing a factor against her to where for me, she's here at number 215. Now, number 214, moving on to a player that I don't think is particularly good as a Big Brother player, though they did face a lot of adversity while in there, and that person is Amber Bizotra from BB16, who obviously goes on to be a challenge winner. But this is, again, just solely assessing her as a Big Brother player, and on Big Brother, she didn't play particularly well. I mean, she was lumped into the bomb squad, but even then, like, literally lumped in, as in Devin just randomly added her to the alliance with no real basis around it. But again, was never really looked at as a true member of the alliance. She was never really involved in any decisions that they made. She was simply just looked on the outs, used as a pawn multiple times, and gets taken out pretty unceremoniously because she was looked at as a big physical threat. But again, for me, the main thing that keeps her just high on this list is, again, that she faced these very weird circumstances with just Caleb being really obsessed with her, and that affecting her game with people lumping her with Caleb and people eventually wanting her out for the sake of Caleb. And it really just feels like everyone just attached herself to Caleb despite the fact that she wanted nothing to do with him and was simply attached to him because of his obsession with her, which I do think is pretty unlucky circumstances there. Where really I feel like Amber, again, well, again, I don't think she actually is the best player. She at least could be. Again, she did seem to be decent in challenges. She seemed to be socially affable to where I could see a world where she is like a competent player, but really she just had no opportunity to do so because of Caleb's obsession over her, which is enough grace I'll give her to put her here number 214. Number 213, moving on to a couple first boots from their seasons. These people that obviously didn't get much to demonstrate in their runs, but I think actually demonstrate some decent ability. And at number 213, we're starting that off with a player that I probably have a bit more faith in due to some outside circumstances. But here I'm still putting Ovi from BB21. And I'm straight up, Ovi's run on BB21 is not particularly great. Obviously, it's one where he's right away left on the outskirts of the majority alliance, where despite the fact that he was trying to really bond with Jack and Jackson, they always looked at him as pretty expendable. And overall, it was just kind of a little bit awkward socially in the house. But I think there's a couple things to prop up with Ovi. Particularly the fact that, again, he wasn't going to be targeted week one initially and was kind of screwed over due to some last second changes from Christy, where really Kemi was the target for most of the week until it literally just falling onto Ovi due to Christy deciding not to target Kemi. Yet Sam had already promised Cliff to use the veto. So he kind of just defaulted on taking out Ovi just because of Sam's promise at that point, which is, I think, pretty unlucky circumstances for him. Also, again, like he did have pretty close allies and likes of Cliff and Nicole, though at the end of the day, that didn't do him much good. But I do think something that is like kind of propelling me on Ovi, especially in terms of his strategic ability, is seeing him on Sequester Minis, where through that, I do have a bit more faith in his overall game ability to where he did make it very far in the BBUS versus BB Can game and did show a good chunk of game ability there to where, again, like I do feel like Ovi, again, if we were to play again, I would feel pretty good about him. Where, again, I just think BB21 was a very bad cast for him, but still a player that demonstrates some ability to where I do have him here number 213. Now number 212, we have probably the prototypical player that people always talk about as this first boot that had a lot of potential. And at 212, we do have Brian Hart. And Brian Hart, I think, is a bit of a mixed bag to where, again, a lot of people do talk about Brian Hart as someone that could have been this really great player. I don't know if I personally actually see that. While I do think he was very strategically minded and did do some very impressive work early on and really manipulating Jerry to just do whatever he wanted. The problem is that obviously he did it too overtly to where too many people recognize what he was doing, and that obviously leads to most of the house gathering against him to where he ends up being the target by the end of week one in a spot where his own pawn and Jerry ends up being the one to actually take him out of the game. So again, that is really bad. But again, I do agree with the sense that, yeah, at least he is strategically minded. He did show some potential there in being able to get his way, at least initially. So he for sure is still one of the better first boots in the history of the show. But I do think there are some issues in the fact that, again, he is just someone that kind of comes off as a bit too schemy. He's someone that is kind of obvious in what he's doing. And really, even if he were to play again, I do feel like he's someone that wouldn't really have that much of a shot in the grand scheme of things, especially like long term. But it's someone that, again, demonstrates some ability to where he's here number 212. Number 211, another first boot here. This one being someone that I don't know if I have as much faith in their strategic ability as the last couple we talked about, but it's someone that I do think it was actually in a pretty good spot and got screwed over pretty massively by the end. That person is Steve from BB20. Summer Steve 2018, where again, Steve coming into the season, despite him being this guy much older than the rest of the cast and someone that should have been this massive outlier, is able to actually do pretty good work and able to become ingrained within the Falte Alliance to where all of them really loved him and wanted to keep him around. Though he gets very unfortunate the fact that he did the worst in the initial comp that led to Tyler thinking of him as a very easy nominee. But even then, again, he was safe for most of the week. Again, the entire Falte side of the house really wanted to save him. And the only reason he goes is due to a last second massive play from Tyler and him tricking Caitlyn into voting out Steve, which is a pretty insane play. And one that does show again that Steve got outplayed by Tyler, but I still think it's a very unlucky circumstance for Steve, especially because it's not even like Tyler really wanted Steve out of the game. It's more so that he wanted Sam to stay, and Steve just was kind of unlucky that he got put on the block to begin with. So again, I think considering his archetype of being this older guy that was even lying about his job, and through that you would think he would be a relatively early boot, the fact that he was able to build such a strong bond with a lot of the people in the game at that point was pretty impressive to see. So for me, he's here at number 211. Now at 210, moving on to a player that I actually thought had a lot of potential in the game. While this person gets simply just outplayed by the time they go home, I do feel like there were some glimpses of this person being a pretty good player. So at 210, I do have Laura Crosby from BB11. And Laura is someone that I think on paper, you would just think of them as someone that, again, pretty much got outplayed in week 1, lost out in the Brayden vote, and proceeded to be targeted by Ronnie the following week and got taken out. However, I think there's actually a lot of things to prop Laura up for. I mean, first off, the fact that she was even able to get a tie on Brayden to begin with. I mean, Brayden was someone that, again, was very abrasive and made racial slurs in the house, yet despite that, she was able to get half the house to try to keep him around. I think that is something that, again, while I wouldn't want to be someone supporting Brayden, is something that is impressive in the game. We then follow that up with her being able to call out Ronnie and recognizing that Ronnie was the one that flipped, which, to be fair, doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out, but it does show some awareness in her game, though, again, kind of an issue is the fact that it made Ronnie aware of the fact that she knew, which is not particularly great. But even then, I mean, she wasn't even going to be targeted for a lot of that week. Really, the target initially was going to be Russell, to where Russell was going to get backdoored that week until Ronnie stopped the plan at the last second. But even then, if she had stayed on the block against Jeff, I think there's a serious chance that Jeff goes as well, to where, again, I think she gets very unlucky in the game as well. But even on her way out, she's able to put this bigger bullseye on Ronnie's back by really exposing all of his lies. And again, I think Laura is actually a pretty competent player. The reason she's not higher on the list is that she technically fails at most of the things she tries, and she ultimately fails to save Brayden and is immediately taken out the following week. But again, I think there is some acumen to give to her. So for me, it's enough to put her here at 210. Now, 209, we're backing right off of Laura from BB11. We do have Ronnie from BB11. And again, Ronnie for me, I think is a very interesting player to assess in the fact that obviously he was pretty effective in week 1. I mean, he does play the middle pretty well. Obviously ends up being exposed by week 2. To where once he's a social pariah in the house, yet despite that still had a grouping of allies that wanted to keep him around. The likes of Shima, Jesse, and Natalie, who really fought for him to stay. And while he is still technically an early boot, being the 4th boot, and could have easily been the 3rd had Jesse not won HOH, I do think he demonstrates, again, some decent game ability at the very beginning through playing the middle. And he very nearly made a very big move in week 2 and getting Russell out of the game. But to be fair, him not going through that is part of the issue with his game to begin with, and what really ends up exposing him as well, where, again, it's a bit of a mixed game. Again, he was playing the middle at the beginning very well. He comes very close to staying at the end, but his game for me is a bit rocky, though I do feel like he has to be above Laura just due to the fact that he just really outplayed her, which is why he's here at number 209. Number 208, we're kind of starting this mini tier here of cult leaders, if you will. These players that, despite them not seeming to be actually that great of players, did have a massive backing around them and people that really worshiped them in the game after they left, despite them being early boots. And at 208, we're starting that off with Riley from BB25. And Riley is a person that I think is actually a pretty bad player. I don't think Riley has many chops for the game. I think she's someone that strategically is a bit all over the place, someone that is too loose with information. She doesn't really have that great of a grasp of the game, despite the fact that she was a fan. But what she does do very well is the fact that she was very good socially, to where, again, like, the people that were in her core alliance really worshipped her. The likes of Jag, Matt, Blue, and Cameron were just so loyal to her. To where even after she leaves, they constantly talked about her. And she does come very close to staying, where she had a very good bond with Sari, and through that, the votes were flipped at a point, and it did seem like Cameron was going home over her until he changed the last second. Also, she gets pretty unlucky in the fact that Heisen wins HOH, where most people were just going to come for Cameron instead of Riley, though Hisam was one of the few people that actually directly wanted to go for Riley and really enforced his will. To where, again, I do think there is some unluckiness with Riley, especially also considering the fact that Jared was involved, who obviously leaked their alliance to Cirie. Again, there's a lot of unlucky circumstances with Riley, but at the end of the day, I don't think she's a good player. I think she was very sloppy in how she actually played, and I don't really see much potential for her in many seasons, but she at least has a lot of things to really prop her up, which is why she's here at 208. Number 207, moving on to a similar player, though probably one that's a bit more active strategically and didn't actually get voted out themselves, and that person is Paloma from BB24. And Paloma's the player that I think is a big what if. I think there is a lot of question on like how Paloma would have done long term had she not quit the game. Now, obviously, she was already starting to struggle in the house, and really, it would not be a surprise if people just eventually let her go due to that. But Paloma is someone that, like, well, again, I do think she's a bit of a sloppy player in how she plays. She is still a very aggressive player, and one that was able to get a lot done in her short run on the season. She really cultivated this massive majority group on her side and really got the ball rolling and putting this bullseye on Taylor, along with the fact of putting together this power structure that really runs the house for the first 3 weeks of the show until obviously the leftovers takes over, along the fact that, again, had there been a normal vote, she would have been safe. Now, straight up, she probably goes home in week 1 anyway, considering the twist involved, where more than likely Pooch does end up picking her to go against Taylor, and Taylor probably beats her in that specific comp, but again, that would have been her being screwed over by a twist as well, where, like, I think Paloma is someone that definitely had legs in the game. Again, definitely had this massive cult around her that were devastated when she left, but I still think is a pretty sloppy player all around, and one that, again, like, didn't really take to the Big Brother house that well, where for me, she ends up landing here at number 207. Now at 206, we have another player that is commonly talked about as if he's a cult leader, and this person is Eric Littman from BB6, aka Cappy. To where, again, Cappy is someone that, again, like, was very good at building this very strong coalition around him. Obviously, he had Maggie inherently, but also built an extremely strong bond with Yvette. He then had the likes of April and Jen and Bo on his side. So again, he had this massive backing in the game. All the fact that he also cultivated this all guys alliance early on and had this duo with James early on. So again, it really felt like he was completely running the game for the first 2 weeks. Where outside of Janelle, he pretty much had everyone else in his corner initially. Though obviously things flip where he ends up taking out Michael, and through that, Kaysar and Janelle have this vendetta against him where they target him the following week. Though even then, it was very difficult to get Cappy out of the game. It really had to be this situation where Kaysar did what seemed like the impossible and entirely flipping the power structure and cultivating this new majority alliance, which was a very difficult move to pull off. Now, outside that, I don't think Eric is that good of a player in the grand scheme of things. Again, I do think he came off as a bit abrasive. He made some strategic blunders in my mind where, and while he did target Michael under the guise of him doing this to keep the women safe, I still feel like it is a mistake for his game to get rid of Michael over Janelle. And really, it's like once he had a target on his back, I mean, he was probably not long for the game in the long term anyway, but like still, I do feel like there is like some good game ability from just how undyingly loyal he was able to get some people to be to him, which for me is good enough to put him at 206. Now at 205, we're moving on to a player that I did not know what to do with, because this player has a lot bad with his game, but still did technically run the game in the first half of the season. That person is Jared from BB25. And again, it's just difficult to assess Jared because a lot of his game is predicated by the fact that he had Cirie in the game. Where that had not been the case, who knows how Jared's run goes, and where he was pulled into the majority alliance at the beginning, and obviously he ends up leaking that alliance to Cirie, which ends up shifting the power structure, but even then it was probably to his benefit considering he was towards the bottom of that initial group. But again, with that, he was essentially running the game alongside Cirie and Izzy for the early portions of the game. The problem is that he's also just a bad player and one that would just be extremely sloppy in the game, while also just making enemies of people for no reason. Particularly his relationship with Corey in America, to where he just burned those relationships for no real reason, which does lead to the later flip, where again, he is 100% culpable for the flip that happens on Izzy, where I feel like that's almost entirely on Jared. To where despite having HOH the following week, he's not able to gain any social capital back to where he's just targeted again the following week. Again, it is a very bad game. But again, he did technically run the game for a point and was doing well socially early on. And again, it was decent competition. So again, it's enough to put him here at number 205, despite all the strategic missteps he makes. Now, number 204, moving on to a grouping of players here that did make deeper runs on their seasons, but never really had much going for their games. At 204, we do have Jasmine from BB24, who, again, at least initially was part of the Majority Alliance. She was being grouped in with the girls and had a good relationship with like Nicole and Amira and Paloma and Alyssa. And again, was in a somewhat decent spot early on. She obviously won the HOH in week 2. That gave her some credibility in the game and ended up making a good move for her and taking out Pooch, even though, again, she really wanted to take out Taylor. And really, it's like her obsession with Taylor. That's definitely a knock against her. Where taking out Taylor for her personally was not even good, considering Taylor actually wanted to work with her. And even beyond that, kind of just becomes an expendable number moving forward, where she's not really lumped into much of what's going on and is kind of just left there when they go after the bigger targets and Amira, Nicole, and Daniel. So she's eventually taken out pretty unceremoniously. Where again, I do think she's still a pretty bad player, but at least she had some decent positioning early on, which is why she's here at number 204. Now, number 203, another person very similar to Jasmine game-wise in my mind. That person is Rockstar from BB20. And Rockstar's another one that I don't think there's much really going on game-wise for Rockstar, to where while she was decently socially, especially with her own core group, and the fact that, again, within the Falte Alliance, she was in a pretty good spot. I mean, she had the relationship with Caitlyn, and with Haley, she was pretty safe for a lot of the early game. She still, again, didn't really have much going on strategically, and she obviously fails at keeping Caitlyn on their side. Despite her having one of the closest relationships to her, she is kind of just on the bottom throughout a lot of the game, simply because the Falte Alliance just could not get a win under their belt, and eventually just gets taken out of the game post-jury, though even then gets a bit unlucky circumstances, the hacker twist being involved, where she should have been safe for that week, though isn't due to unlucky circumstances. But still, I think she's a mostly passive player, to where I would have been willing to put her a bit higher had she been a more active player in the game, though really she wasn't. And at the end of the day, I do kind of lump her in here with Jasmine in being in similar spots in the game. So because that for me, she's here at 203. Now, number 202, we're moving on to a player that seemed to be decently positioned at points in the game, but was just all around a pretty bad player, and that person is Kiara from BB3. Kiara is this player that, again, initially was in the Majority Alliance. She was lumped into the grouping with Lisa and Roddy and Eric. Obviously had this showmance with Roddy, and really ends up being in a solid spot early on, only for it to kind of crumble through the fact that Roddy and Eric end up taking out Tanya in week 2, which was one of her closest allies, which is a pretty bad spot for her. And really from that point on, her game is just really rocky, to where she ends up flipping on Lisa when Lisa and Eric are on the block, which was pretty detrimental to her game there, when Lisa ends up staying, to where she then proceeds to win HOH, only to then target Josh, one of the only people on her side, which was an astronomically dumb move, only for her to then be taken out the following week, which, I mean, to be fair, she gets taken out by Amy, who comes back into the game at that point, who she had a vendetta against. But even then, it did feel like a good chunk of the house would have still been okay with taking Kiara out that week. Though really, even then, there was still a good chunk of people coming into that week still targeting Kiara anyway. So again, I think Kiara's move to take out Josh is understandably one of the dumbest moves in Big Brother history. But again, Kiara was mostly well-liked socially. Again, she built this really strong bond with Danielle, where Danielle wanted to keep her around. She, again, was well integrated early on, but it really didn't last for that much further than that, to where, again, like, I think she's mostly a bad player, especially strategically, though for this list, it was enough to put her here at number 202. Number 201, we're moving on to a player that I kind of didn't know what to do with, because I feel like this player is one that doesn't do that much right, but also I think gets pretty unlucky when they eventually go home, and that person is Kat from BB21. And Kat is a player that, like, early on, she did not do particularly well. She was someone that was looked at as a pretty easy out, to where I think she probably goes home in week 1 had Sam not made that promise to use the veto on Cliff, where had the nom stayed the same with her and Cliff on the block, I think more than likely she does go out there. But even beyond that, I mean, she really isn't involved in the main Majority Alliance, though kind of has attachment to it due to the fact that she has a relationship with Holly, to where really I feel like that's a major reason why she even ends up staying in week 5, where she could have very easily gone home there, though ends up staying simply due to her relationship with Holly, which made it so Jackson couldn't vote her out, to where there was a lot of talk about saving Sam, though it just never really could come together there. But following that again, like it seemed like she was back into a somewhat decent spot where Jessica wins HOH and takes out Jack, to where really following that, again, she did have this new core group with her of Cliff, Nicole, Jessica, and her, where with having like Jackson and Holly on the side, they could have been in this spot to have a pretty deep run in the game. However, they do get really unlucky in the fact that Tommy wins HOH in a spot where Tommy ends up being one of the only people that I think would have actually targeted Kat during that week. And even despite that, I mean, there was still the twist where Christy went on the block there, and Christy would have definitely gone home had the veto not been used on her, which again gets very unfortunate. The fact that Tommy also wins the veto and uses the veto on her, when mixing down the fact that also Kat gets a bit unfortunate. She's again on the block against Cliff, to where I think had she been on the block against most other people, I think she could have found a way to stay there, considering she did actually change a decent amount of minds by the end of the week, though was never able to get all the votes together. So again, I think there is some acumen there, Kat. Though really the rest of her game is again very sloppy, with her just simply being on the outs with a very loose attachment to the main core through Holly. I do think she gets a lot of lucky breaks, though gets a pretty unlucky break in her final results, where I think it kind of evens out here to where she's here at number 201. Now number 200, we're moving on to a player that is pretty universally known as a really bad player. And like straight up, the main reason they're this high is simply because they were in the majority for a lot of the game, but I think their actual gameplay within that is really bad, and that person is Raven from BB19. And again, Raven is someone that was working alongside Paul the entire season, was in the majority group, didn't really do much within that majority group, but she was there. He thought she was running things. That's something. Obviously, she was really hated by most of the cast and had no real shot at winning the jury vote, despite the fact that Matt really thought that she would, and really just ends up blindly following Paul throughout the entire season, even after Paul is one of the people in charge of getting rid of Matt. She's really aloof to that and proceeds to get taken out herself eventually at the final 6. I mean, she does get a bit unlucky there, to where technically if Alex did not win HOH, Alex would have gone there, but still, Raven was probably just going to go anyway in final 5, to where Raven did not play a particularly good game, despite the fact that she was in the majority. Pretty much played as bad of a game as you could have, considering you were as solid as you were in the majority alliance for as long as you were. So because that, for me, she's here at number 200. Number 199, we're moving on to a player that I think was mostly bad, but they at least had one shining moment, even though within that there's also some mixed gameplay. And that person is Jessica Milagros from BB21. And Jessica is someone that was mostly aloof for the first half of the game. And she was outside the majority group. She was someone that was kind of looked at as someone that could be used as a pawn, someone that was mostly expendable. So while she did build some decent bonds in the house, she just really did not know what was going on in the house until obviously 6 shooters blew up. And once that happened and she won HOH, she made a big move. She did put up Jack and Jackson. Now again, it was a bad move. You want to guarantee that Jack goes home, but still, it works out for her. But the problem for me is that beyond that, I don't feel like she really even plays well after that round. Where after that round, she's once again kind of left on the outs. Where while she is taken all the way to final 7, she's not really that involved in what's going on. Being left behind as like Cliff and Nicole build a final 4 with Holly and Jackson, where despite the fact that Jessa was working with them, she kind of gets left behind there. To where like really, I feel like a lot of her game is one that really just lacks any agency. It's one where she doesn't really have much of a clue of what's really going on. But again, at least she made one big move. I guess that's enough to put her here at number 199. Now number 198, we're moving on to a player that I thought was a very messy player. I mean, this was a player that was just all over the board, to where while there was some decent play at points, I think as a whole they're still really bad, and that person is Blue from BB25. And again, Blue's just a bit all over the place to me. One that, while initially in a decent spot, being in the core group, obviously that core group crumbles right away, and to be fair, she didn't really play well from that spot anyway. Again, where she was like leaking information, she was kind of too overt with her position in the game. To where beyond that, I mean, she's kind of just on the bottom alongside Jag and being these two remnants of the handful alliance that don't really have much traction in the game. To where really she was going to be evicted in week 4 had it not been for her relation with Jared. And then really she's left out of this major flip that occurs in week 6 because of her connection with Jared. And at that point, she had been like tricked to target Jag, who should have been one of her closest allies. She, again, was just playing such an actively bad game. But then I think once Jared goes, I actually feel like her game turns around a bit. While her game never really gains much traction, and she's constantly someone that could potentially go home, I do feel like she actually does some decent work in getting Jag and Matt to turn against Corey in America. Now again, the question is, was that even the good move for her to begin with? But again, the fact that she was able to constantly get them looking in that direction, I think is some decent work there. Now the rest of her game is still pretty bad, and she is taken out before America anyway. But again, I think there is at least some like effective play at points, to where again, it's enough for me to land her here number 198. Now, number 197, we're moving on to a player that I look at kind of similarly to Blue. While this person actually didn't make it as far as Blue, I do think they at least had a stronger early game, and that person is Elena from BB19. And again, Elena is another one I think is a player that can leak a bit too much information, someone that isn't the greatest strategically in the game, but I do think like early on she was at least in a decent spot. Again, she was working alongside Paul and was a pretty loyal number to Paul, where Paul did want to take her pretty far into the game initially, though obviously that eventually crumbles due to her getting pretty close to the likes of Jessica and obviously having Mark, and her again seeming to be one of the better social players out there, to where that did become a threat to Paul. So from that point on, again, she's kind of aloof, to where again obviously gets blindsided the Ramses vote. After that, she's clearly on the bottom alongside Mark, and eventually taking out the double after Mark wins the veto. So again, that's not particularly great, but I do think her early positioning is decent. And again, she's a very social player, one that is liked throughout the early game, to where again, for me, it's enough to land her here at number 197. At number 196, we're moving on to a player that's just a massive enigma to me. This is a player that just had so much potential, and I still think even after the show they demonstrated some potential, but they just simply didn't do anything, and actively didn't do anything. And that person comes from BB25. Here we do have Mimi. And initially I had Mimi higher on this list, simply because again, I do think there is a lot of potential there with Mimi. But I think when like looking through the list and actually trying to categorize people and kind of lump similar players together, I feel like I had to move Mimi down, where again, like just straight up, Mimi doesn't do much on her season. She again actively doesn't do so, in the sense that she thought it was a good strategy to just literally lay down and be under the radar. But again, it's a misguided strategy, where again, if she were to somehow play again, which I doubt will ever happen, I think she could do very, very well. Like, her actual appearance on the show that we have to base this list off is really bad, where she just had so many opportunities to better herself in the game, just takes none of those. Even the big flip in the house that ends up occurring that greatly benefits her positioning in the house, even that was something that she didn't even really want to happen. She just wanted to save Felicia. And to me, it's just kind of a shame the way that Mimi's game plays out, as again, I think there is potential there. She just actively did nothing about it. That's why I have her at 196. Now, number 195, we're moving on to a massive batch here of some of the better early boots in the show's history. And we're starting all that off with a player that I think just has a lot of potential in the game, and that person is Dominic from BB13. And Dominic's someone that, again, like I just think has a lot of potential. I think he's someone that if he were to play again, I think he could do very well. Despite him coming to the show not really knowing what the show was, I think he ends up picking up on it pretty quickly. Again, like he instantly tries to lead the charge against the vets. And while obviously it doesn't work out for him, I think it probably was the correct call to make, while mixing that into the fact that he is able to get back in Brennan and Rachel's good graces for a little bit and have them wanting to use the veto on him on week 2. I think that's pretty good. Obviously, his final week, he comes pretty close to staying, where there was a point where Brennan and Rachel were convinced to take out Jeff and Jordan. And obviously, he builds this really strong with Danny, to where, again, like I think there's definitely things to praise here. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think he really ever got to truly live up to that potential, but I think that potential was there, which is why I have him here at number 195. Now, number 194, we're moving on to a player that definitely faced a lot of adversity while in the game, to where while I do think they definitely do make some mistakes, I think their game's pretty solid considering their placement. That person is Howard from BB15. And Howard is a player that, again, like we talked about with Candace, is obviously one that faced a lot of adversity in the house through the racism that was there and how he had to combat that. And obviously I do have a lot of respect for how he handles that situation. But when tying it back to the game, I do feel like he is a player that, again, like had a decent first couple weeks. Again, he was in the moving company. Even when the moving company crumbled, he does flip, though does it in a bit of a half measure, to where he tries to kind of play both sides, and again, that doesn't really work out for him, which I do think that stain against him really plagues him coming into his boot round. But again, that does keep him safe for the next few rounds, only for him to be targeted due to how sketchy people felt like he was due to that move, which again, obviously in this house, there definitely were racial biases held against him, but at least the justification for why he goes out is actually a pretty bad move that he makes. But again, I think as a whole, he is a still solid player. He did seem to be very well liked early on, and again, was playing the middle decently well early on, but obviously that did crumble not too long after that. But again, to me, at least was a pretty active player in the game. And that's why he's here at number 194. Now, number 193, we're moving on to a player that I don't look at this person as great. I do think they definitely have some major high points to their game. That person is Sam from BB21. And Sam is someone that I think, considering his placement in the game, I think actually plays a somewhat solid game. Again, he is someone that was kind of this offshoot of the Grateful Alliance, to where while he wasn't a core member of that group, he was at least attached to that group, to where, again, he was at least looped in on what was going on. He also had a really strong bond with Nick and Bella. He did win the first 2 vetoes, which I think is probably enough knock against him, the fact that he didn't need to win those vetoes and just putting a bigger target on his back. But obviously he eventually ends up being blindsided alongside Nick and Bella, and is kind of playing from the bottom from that point on. Though again, in his final week, I do think there's a lot of impressive work there to where he very nearly stays, where had it not been for Kat having a pregame relationship with Holly, I think he very much does stay in that spot. Though again, they can never really organize the votes together. But again, I think he does a really effective campaign there. And again, considering how he was decently positioned early on, despite the fact that, again, I don't really look at him as the greatest player in the world, and he's someone that like manages threat level really poorly and was on the bottom for over half of his game. I mean, for me, he still is someone that has some potential there to where he's here at number 193. Now, number 192, we're moving on to a player that was also in a pretty strong spot at one point in the game, actually a dominant spot in the game at one point, though it all crumbles very quickly, and that person is Nicole from BB24. And again, I think Nicole was in probably the best position in the game coming into week 3, to where while obviously the leftover formation happens and she ends up being on the bottom the following week and ends up going home, their own ally essentially backdooring her. Again, like, I think she was in a pretty decent spot up until week 3. Now, again, you can definitely qualm with how she treated people, particularly Taylor. Like, that was pretty bad. Also, week 1 was not the greatest for her, where while she was well liked in the house and someone that people wanted to work with, she wasn't really looped into many alliances. It really wasn't until the end of week 1, after Paloma left, that she was finally grouped into the majority alliance at that point. But again, she does take that position and really runs with it until the point of the leftovers formation, where from that point, again, she's pretty much a dead man walking and ends up going the following week. But again, there was that point where she was in a very dominant position, and again, she did have really solid allies around her, to her while she does get very much outplayed by the leftovers, I do feel like the game she plays is good enough to be here at 192. Now, number 191, we're moving on to a player that I think their game that they play in their season is actually pretty good, considering the fact that they're an early boot, but I do think them as a player is a bit more questionable, and that person is Izzy from BB25. And again, Izzy is someone that was running the game alongside Cirie and Jared for the first half of the game. Again, it is a very impressive stretch of gameplay of them just constantly being in the middle. However, I do feel like she was very benefited from the fact that Cirie and Jared were there to begin with, and to be someone that she could latch on to where, straight up, I don't think Izzy is the greatest player in the world. I think Izzy is someone that got on people's nerves. She does have a bit of an aggressive personality, to where, again, a decent chunk of the house did not like her. And usually people that were on the opposing side to her were directly coming for her. I mean, coming out of week 1, her and Heisen were the big targets for the handful side of the house. And also, she's just like not able to hide her emotions, how much she hates Cameron and Red, to where they're very aware at the fact that Izzy is coming for them, to where obviously they don't make a move initially, but I would put that more down to how Cirie handled her relationship with Red more so than anything Izzy does well on her own. Now, truth be told, I don't really fault her that much for her boot week, to where, I mean, there definitely are things to qualm with, but I would put more of that on Jared and how poorly Jared plays than things that Izzy does that much actively wrong. Or even though, again, like her telling Corey that he needs to break up America is pretty bad. But again, I think as a whole, it is a rocky game, one that there are definitely major high points, but I just feel like even though the game is relatively strong, I just do not feel that great about her as a player. Or I think on most appearances, she's just taken out relatively early due to her just having personality conflicts with a good chunk of people. And because of that, for me, again, I have her here at number 191. Now, number 190, we're moving on to a player that does get massively screwed over by a twist, though I think surrounding that, I'm not entirely sure how good of a player they really were, and that person is Parker from BB9, who, again, I did have Parker obviously very high on my first boot ranking, as I do think he's someone that shouldn't have been a first boot. But I think when we look at him as a player and the things he did on the season, I do question some of his game ability, where, while, yeah, he was definitely screwed over by the fact that he was latched onto Jen, who was this massive target in the game, and he is someone that did have allies at a point. He did have Alex, and he did have Maddie on his side. He still proceeds to be targeted by one of those allies in Alex, and also is someone that seemed to be a bit of a hothead in the game, and we do see him being in the fights with people constantly, to where, while, again, they were in reaction to either people calling him a snake or just other more gameplay based things, I do still think it's not a particularly good look, and it's one that I think could have potentially got him in danger down the road anyway. Now, again, I still think at the end of the day, he does get screwed over by a twist. I do think he definitely had some longevity in him had that twist not occurred, but again, considering his very early boot on the season, along the fact that I just don't know how confident I really am in his game ability as a whole, I do still have to put him here at 190 or 189, literally the exact same thing, just slightly higher. We do have Alex from BB9. Again, same thing. He was attached to Amanda. People hate Amanda. He gets voted out because of that. Now, again, like surrounding that, I don't think he necessarily plays it that well. well. I mean, he doesn't really do that much actively to stay. It does very much feel like he is just so angry at Amanda that he kind of gives up to a degree, to where while Amanda does end up campaigning and actually does so like kind of actually somewhat well, he doesn't really do much to change their fate. And even beyond that, I mean, like even his first HOH reign, like it's still pretty bad. I mean, the fact that he is targeting Parker, someone that was on his side, that's pretty dumb. To where again, like I do still put more of the blame on Amanda for why he goes out, but I don't think he plays that squeaky clean outside that. While again, I do think he is a player that had potential, I don't think he really demonstrated a lot of that on this season. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 189. Now 188, we're moving on to a player that is really boring, but seemed to be a pretty stable presence in the game. And that person is Eric from BB3. And again, Eric, I think, is a bit of a questionable player in the sense that he wasn't really playing that hard. I mean, while he was working alongside Roddy and Josh, I do feel like they were probably a bit more active of players than Eric. Though, despite that, Eric was in a pretty solid position to where, again, we do see Eric and Roddy just instantly being the majority group. We do see them make a move and taking out Tanya in week 2, which, I mean, to be fair, you can question if that was even a good move, considering it lessened numbers on their own side, but he still was a proactive enough player to execute that move. He was, again, a pretty central figure within his side of the house, though he obviously gets targeted by Jerry, to which he ends up getting kind of sniped out of the game there with a tied vote against him, which, again, still definitely faults him for his threat management. The fact that people realize how good of a spot he was. Also, people realize that he was in a showmance with Lisa that made him a target as well. Where, again, there's definitely things to fault there. But, I think he is a mostly stable player, one that was in a pretty good spot for a lot of the season. So even in his boot, I think he gets a little bit unfortunate who exactly wins HOH. To where even in that situation, it was pretty impressive that Kiara ends up voting to save Eric over Lisa. So again, I think there definitely are some impressive aspects to his game, but still one that, again, was a bit too big of a threat. Kind of blatantly so, to where he's here number 188. Now 187, we're now getting into the people that were on my top pre-jurors list. So we're starting it off with Nick from BB8. And Nick, I think, is a player with a lot of potential. I mean, he clearly showed a lot of social ability and a lot of people loving him in the house. He clearly was this physical guy, and he seemed to have some decent chops strategically, in the sense that he was playing the middle pretty well. Now, obviously, the issue comes from the fact that he was kind of screwed over by America's Player, to where because of America's Player, he gets kind of framed for these hinky votes, and through that ends up being someone not looked at as trustworthy, where he gets taken out in week 4. But again, like, there is some pretty decent play from Nick across most of his run, to where he is playing the middle decently well, and is able to get into the core group, despite the fact that he was initially attached to the Mrs. Robinson alliance. And really, as a whole, I think Nick is a player that just has so much potential if he were to return, but he's still relatively early boot. So because of that, for me, he's here at 187. Now number 186, we're moving on to a player that also gets pretty unfortunate in how their game plays out, with them kind of being sniped out of the game. And that person is David Lane from BB4. Again, David's someone that I think was playing decently well up until his boot. Now, again, you can definitely qualm with some decisions, like getting rid of Michelle. Despite Michelle being a very loyal number to him, I do feel like as a whole, again, I think he was playing decently well, playing the middle, playing the Stooges, along with obviously having the Elite Eight, while also having this really strong core of him, Erica, and Jack that were in a pretty solid spot at that point. Where, again, I think he gets very unfortunate in the fact that Nathan had won the veto and used it on Allison, as otherwise, I do think, again, Nathan would have been the target had veto been used normally, and in that spot, just felt like they took out David because they kind of had to, as what other option was there? For a while, yeah, you can argue the fact that, okay, they could have targeted Erica over him. I still think it's a position that, again, was very rare to occur, and one that, again, I don't really fault David that much for how he goes out here, especially because he puts up a pretty decent fight as well. I mean, he comes relatively close to staying, with him putting a pretty decent pitch to the Stooges, and even then having Allison and Erica vote for him to stay. So again, I think there's a lot of decent play from David, to where, again, I would definitely qualm with some strategic decisions he makes, but considering how early of a boot he is and how decently positioned he seemed to be, I would put him here at number 186. Now at 185, we're moving on to a similarly positioned player, though probably one that had a bigger bullseye on their back, but also one that is probably one of the best challenge competitors in the history of the show, and that person is Christian from BB23. And I think Christian and David are somewhat comparable in the sense that they, as they were taken out due to very close votes, they had a lot of allies surrounding them. Now Christian made it more rounds than David. That was obviously worse positioned than David coming into his boot round. However, I do think Christian is also, again, one of the best comp competitors we've ever seen. And he had a pretty insane win record, to where, again, I think that is something you do have to factor in here, is overall comp ability, especially in a game like Big Brother, where comps give you so much power in the game. So for me, that is pretty much the main deciding factor between him and David, is considering how good he is at the comps, which puts him here at 185. Now at number 184, I believe this is a change from for my original list of best pre-jurors. However, at 184, I am going to have to go with Kaser. I believe I put Kaser at, number 3 on my top pre-jurors list, which he doesn't end up being as high here, though I think a major reason for that is just because simply when looking at the rest of the context of the list, I can't justify putting Kaser much higher than this. Even though, again, I think Kaser is a player that, again, demonstrated a lot of potential his first time around. Again, I think the level of difficulty of his move that he makes is pretty high, and the fact that he was able to pretty flawlessly execute it is very impressive. Along the fact that he had this very solid group of allies around him, to where, again, he just gets very unfortunate in the HOH result following that, to where he gets taken out. Now, again, he doesn't play well when he returns on that season, where he's instantly sniped out of the game again, and then obviously in BB7, he's kind of a non-factor, to where he had so many opportunities to take a shot at Will and Boogie, but never takes it, though, to be fair, I think part of that is the fact to do the pregame. But then on 22, I mean, like, it wasn't a great run either. I mean, he definitely had some pretty bad reads on the game at points and was kind of targeting the wrong people. And in Kaser as a whole, I think when we're looking at the negatives, there definitely are a lot of negatives. But I think his one major positive, and the fact that he made that really insane week 3 move in taking out Cappy, is, again, enough to put him relatively high on this list still, considering the fact that he's a 3-time pre-juror, where I still have him here at 184. Now at number 183, we're moving on to a player that did have a pretty solid majority alliance, though at the same time made a really dumb move to make themselves the biggest target within that alliance, and that person is Jennifer from BB6. And again, Jennifer is someone that, again, like, was in the Friendship Alliance, had a very strong core. Had that group continued to win HOHs, she would have been good. She would have been in a decent spot, even though then she was at the top of that pecking order anyway. But still, I mean, like, obviously the big issue is the fact that she makes the move against Kaser, which makes her the biggest target on the board, where she's just an easy target after that. But really the rest of her game is just kind of fine. I mean, like, initially she was in a decent spot. I mean, there was like some talk about putting her up in week 1, but nothing too serious. And beyond that, again, was just kind of attached to Eric and was part of his side of things, and was just playing a bit of an under the radar game. But again, I think considering how bad of a move she made, despite the fact that she had a pretty solid alliance, is enough to land her at number 183. Number 182, we're moving on to a player that also had a pretty good backing in the game, though again, they just simply were not winning the comps that they needed to. But even beyond that, was not someone that was that well respected in the game. That person is Chelsea from BB9. And again, Chelsea in the pre-jury phase of the game was in a pretty decent spot, had a really good grouping with her and James, and then also with Joshua and Sharon, so they end up winning a lot of comps early on and end up dictating a lot of the action there, though the post-jury they end up really struggling a lot more, to where obviously they lose James initially, to where they're really backstabbed by the likes of Ryan, and then despite being able to execute on the move to take out Maddie, following that they just proceed to not be able to win any comps, despite coming into the final 8 with tied numbers there. They simply just go out one by one because they're not winning comps. And again, Chelsea is obviously the first to go of those, so to be fair, part of that is because of her connection to James. But even despite that, I do feel like she does some pretty bad social play along the way. Again, she just has this massive feud with Natalie, which is not a particularly good look. She doesn't do any effective campaigning, and really is actually just instead doing kind of the opposite, just making herself a ham and doing things for good TV, which, I mean, to be fair, they were, but not overall a great player, but one that, again, at least had decent positioning at points, since she's here at 182. Now, number 181, we're moving to a player that I just look at as an extremely passive player, one that they were in the majority for a lot of the game. They just simply didn't do much within that majority, and that person is Annalise from BB21. And Annalise, to me, is just someone that, again, was there. She was in the majority alliance. She didn't really do much within the majority alliance, but she was a largely affable figure, to where I think on most appearances she probably does well. I mean, like, I don't know why anyone would target Annalise early. I guess she feels like kind of a perfect alliance member, someone that's just gonna kind of blindly follow you. But there, again, there's not really much to truly praise from her either. I mean, she's simply just a very baseline player for one that was in the majority for a lot of the game. And also she gets like taken out due to her connection to Nick, which is kind of a weird circumstance there. And really just the way I look at her game overall, is just at how passive her game was. And considering her core group crumbled early on, and I don't really see much potential for her playing that active of a game. For me, she ends up landing here at 181. Now, number 180, we're moving on to a player that I was very conflicted on where exactly to land this person, and that person is Zakia from BB18. And again, Zakia, I just think is a player that I have a tough time assessing, because I do think she's someone that is pretty passive in the game, especially by the end, where I think she really is just a pawn in Paulie's game and not really doing much to really change her positioning in the game, especially once she knows that she's on the bottom after a Dave Vaughn vote. But again, I think early on, like, while again, she's still not the most active player in the world, she still was involved in a lot of what was going on. I mean, again, and she was one of the newbies to instantly latch on to the vets. She was in multiple alliances on that side of the house, and she was in almost every sub-alliance within that group. And for the most part, again, was someone that was pretty well liked. And to me, I just feel like she probably has more potential in my mind than someone like an Annalise. For while, again, they are pretty similar players on paper, I feel like I would personally have more faith in Zakiya on a return than someone like Annalise, where I feel like there is still some strategy there with Zakiya, even though she is still very passive in her overall play. While I feel like with Annalise, there wasn't really much strategy at all. So again, for me, I do have her here at number 180. Now, number 179, a similarly positioned player, an extremely passive player. And that person is Matt Kleins from BB19, where obviously Matt is someone that is commonly joked around as this person that did nothing in the game and all he did is eat cereal and do Raven. But Matt, I think, is kind of an interesting player when you look back at him, in the sense that I don't think Matt was actually trying to play the game. Now, I think Matt is someone that, if he were actually trying, I think there definitely is some potential there. I think he seems like a very affable person. Someone that, again, kind of gets the game to a degree, but just, like, doesn't care and isn't even trying to win the entire season. Like, his main goal for this season was to get Paul and Raven to the end, where he would drop out at 3. Where, I mean, obviously that is something to criticize, the fact that he wasn't trying to win the game, but I think also the fact that he wasn't trying to win the game makes me think that if he was trying to win the game, maybe he would do better and play more actively. Now, again, would I bank on that? No, but I still think, like, in comparison to Raven in particular, where Raven was really trying to win the game and was so bad at it, at least Matt wasn't trying to win the game and still came off as a very affable person, one that most people in the house liked. So again, at least that's something to where, again, I guess is enough to put him here at 179 and 178. And we're moving on to some of the really bad players that made it super deep in the game. We have Gina Marie from BB15, who, again, not supporting Gina Marie as a person at all. And again, Gina Marie is probably one of the worst finalists in the history of the show, someone that gets to the end of the game and has no real shot at winning. Even beyond that, treat people terribly. Obviously was a major catalyst of the racism on the season. She didn't have that much of a strategic mind in the game. She was kind of just following orders for a lot of it. While she did make some big moves in taking out Amanda in particular, again, that was really just under the orders of Andy. And really beyond that, I mean, like, I don't feel like Gina Marie does much actively well in this season. I'll say the two minor things of positivity I'll give to her is that she is a decent comp competitor. She did win a decent amount of comps. That's something. Other thing is the fact that she was able to recover from all the racism somehow, the where she does end up being in a pretty good spot by the mid game. So again, she's eventually picked up by Andy and they run the show to where, again, like, there's at least that. I mean, is she a good player? No. But I do think it's her comp ability. Really, that probably keeps her as high as she is here at number 178. And 177, another person that's commonly talked about as one of the worst players of all time, we have Victoria from BB16. And Victoria is a player that I actually think is probably a little bit better than people talk about. Where a lot of people talk about Victoria as this, like, brainless player that couldn't do anything, was dragged to the end. And while, like, part of that is true, I do feel like Victoria still had some agency in her game. Again, was her agency wrong? Was she just allowing Derek to run the game? Yeah, but she still did things. She still allowed Derek to do the things that he did. She did follow along with Derek's plans and talk to the people that Derek told her to talk to and do the things that Derek told her to do. And again, that is at least something. She's not, like, absolutely doing nothing in the game. It's just that what she's doing is not necessarily as beneficial for her individual game. But even then, like, she still makes it to final 3. Mind you, she would have been booted earlier had it not been for the rewind twist, but still makes it to final 3 in a spot where, again, like, you can argue her getting some jury votes. Well, again, I don't think it's enough to win. Again, like, I think she probably at least gets votes if she's at the end. So at least that's something where, again, I don't think Victoria's as bad as people say, though still not good. So that's why she's here at number 177. Now at 176, we have a player that I think is one that probably has a lot more win equity than last people we talked about. But I think outside that is pretty much Victoria, but not even making it to final 3. And that person is Kevin Schluber from BB19. And obviously Kevin is a very likable presence. He is definitely one of the more likable people from BB19. However, when looking at his game is simply just not good. He is essentially Paul's Victoria, a person he drags through the game and, again, like, gives him tasks here and there that he's able to execute, but isn't really doing much in the game. He's not really trying to better his position. Where, yeah, at least with Victoria, at least she thought she was running the game alongside Derek. Kevin doesn't even think that. Kevin, like, knows that he's a pawn for Paul, but it's just kind of okay okay with that. Now, again, Kevin had a lot more win equity, where if Kevin gets to the end against really any of the final four, I think he probably wins. But still, there was never really a path for him to do that unless he just won out, which, again, Kevin Schluber's not going to do. So really, I just look at him as an extremely passive player, to where despite his win equity, I don't feel like there's much I could really give him that much praise for. Where he's here at number 176, now at 175. We're moving on to a player I look at pretty similarly, though I think was probably a little bit more active, and that person is Chicken George. Where obviously this is based around his All-Stars run. And again, Chicken George, again, was at least trying to play the game. Was he playing it well? No. Was he really just this pawn for a lot of the other players in the game? Yeah. But again, at least he does, again, make an alliance with Chilltown. He wins an HOH and takes out Howie, which is a pretty big move at that point in the game. Even though in reality, it's also him pretty much being manipulated into not targeting Chilltown in that instance. He's someone that, again, like came into the game as this massive outlier, to where he was an easy target early on, does get targeted by James, only for him to squeak on by from that. And again, makes it all the way to final five. Now, again, did he have any win equity? That's questionable. Also, how much game was he really playing? That's also questionable. But I think there were at least like points where he was playing and at least got stuff done, to where to me, he's a little bit better than Kevin Schluber, and he's here at number 175. Now, 174, again, kind of a similar thing, essentially the female version of Chicken George in my mind, and that person is Jen from BB14. And again, Jen, I think, is someone that, again, like was pretty passive for the most part in the game, though, again, isn't completely passive. She did do some things at points. She did build a strong bond with Frank and tried to work with him towards the end of Frank's run. She also had a really strong bond with like Dan and Danielle, to where they wanted to take her towards the end. They just weren't given the opportunity to comp results. So again, I think Jen is someone that, had Dan been able to do exactly what he wanted and comp results didn't harm him, I think there's definitely a serious chance that Dan takes Jen to the end, to which, again, Jen might beat him. So I think that is something to at least like consider with Jen here. Now, at the end of the day, again, I don't think Jen played particularly well. Again, she was very passive in the first half. Second half, it was largely based around her social connections, more so than her doing much strategically in the game. But again, I think there is some good social work from her towards the end of the game, which is enough to put her at 174. Now, 173, another similar player to this, we do have Adam from BB13. And Adam's a player that I think gets constantly trashed on as one of the worst players to make it far into the game. And again, he obviously represented by this list. Again, I still agree with that. However, I do think there is like some acumen to Adam. Again, he was someone that, again, was very sloppy early on. I'm playing both sides, but again, picking the losing side at most times when he did eventually pick a side. But still, I mean, like, he's able to build a pretty strong bond with Jeff and Jordan, where they were actively working with him. He also started to win some comps in the end game. And if he had gotten to the end of the game, again, I think he at least gets votes, especially if he's against Portia, which was his more likely scenario. Now, again, does he win? No, I think he probably loses 4-3. But again, I think he probably gets 3 votes. That's something. Again, he was at final 3. He was right there. So again, like, it's obviously not a good game for sure. Again, he comes relatively close to being in a situation where he comes 1 vote away from winning the game. So I mean, that's something, I guess, where he's here at number 173. Now 172, I'm on to a player that I think gets lumped in with someone like a Jen, with them coming from the same seasons and both being looked at similarly, though I think this person was a little bit more active than Jen. That person is Joe from BB14, who, again, I think was a bit more active throughout the season. Again, he goes out of his way to make more one-on-one bonds. Bonding with Shane in particular ends up being pretty beneficial to him. He also early on is kind of the catalyst of the flip against Willie, to where he ends up leaking information to Frank that gets Frank to confront Willie. Now, again, he was never really involved in any major alliance, and he was kind of just being dragged along and played obviously a very self-preservation based game, as he never really had much traction in the game. But again, I do think there's at least some points where he is playing the game pretty strategically, especially out of the last few people we talked about. I think he's probably the one that was playing the game most strategically out of, again, like Adam, Jen, George, Kevin, to where, again, I still don't think of him as that good of a player. I don't know if he ever wins if he gets to the end, but again, it's still enough for me to put him at 172. Now 171, we're moving on to a player that played probably too passive of a game on their respective season and kind of peaked at the wrong time, but I think there's like some level of potential there from Bunky from BB2, who, again, I think also played a very self-preservation based game, one that was never really in a true majority group. I mean, while he was like a part of top while that was the thing, again, it didn't really last for that long, and he didn't really have much agency within that group anyway. So obviously he had like a duo of Kent, but then even then Kent gets taken out at 7. Really just feels like a lot of his game is under the will of Nicole and Hardy, to where where he's eventually taken out at 5 due to him starting to just blatantly come after them, which is not particularly great, and obviously making himself a bigger threat in the game. And again, you could argue, okay, he was outplayed by Will and everything, but like still, it's like overall like not particularly great end game to him. So he just becomes the pretty easy move to take out there, with him starting to win comps and everything, where Bunky, again, like it just never really has much agency in the game, though at least there was a point where he picked up steam to where had he somehow gotten to the end, again, he probably could have won. At least that's something. But was still obviously a few rounds out from that. So again, I don't look at him too highly, but amongst the players we just talked about, I feel like he's probably the player that has like the most potential to where he's here at number 171 and number 170. And we're kind of starting this grouping of players that made like somewhat deep runs despite not having much traction in the game. Those still had some decent gameplay at points. And at 178, we do have Bridget from BB18. And Bridget is someone that I think was pretty aloof in the game for first like 2/3 of her game, where she's again on the outs initially with the Jose boot. She's attached to like Natalie and Bronte, who also didn't have much going on at that point. She also then attaches herself to Frank, where she's really just being dragged along by him. However, I think her game does turn around once Frank goes, where I think at that point she does start to do some decent work. I mean, she does enough to bond with the likes of Polly to keep herself safe during a Devon boot week, and then proceeds to then flip against Polly and really leads the charge against the flip, to where while she's obviously the person that takes the fall for it when Corey wins HOH next, again, I do think there is some decent play there. Again, I think Bridget is someone that, again, if she were to play again, I think there's a world where Bridget plays pretty well, but based on what we saw here, she's still someone that was on the bottom for a lot of the game, to where despite the fact that she picked up the game at the very end, it's not enough to put her too high, but she's here at 170. Now 169, a similar-ish player, I mean, one that probably knew the game a bit better and was probably a bit more active in their game throughout all of it, but was still never that well positioned. That person is Sarah Beth from BB23, and again, SB was someone that I think plays okay initially. I mean, while she isn't like part of any big group, she is building these bonds with like Tiffany and Claire, to where they had an alliance together. She obviously had the bond with Kylan that was very influential to her game. Well, again, by the end of pre-jury, she was talked about as a target. She still gets saved over Christian. Now, again, the problem is the fact that I do think she was a bit too blindly loyal to Kylan, with Kylan steering her in the wrong direction. Also, her targeting of DX was just kind of dumb considering her position in the game. And by the time she goes out, she really just has no real chance of saving herself, to where, again, it's definitely a mixed bag of a game, but one that, again, had some decent gameplay early on, and one that is, again, at least an active player. So because of that, for me, she's at 169. Now, number 168, we're moving on to two players back to back here that are both massive mixed bags. So we're going to start off with Natalie from BB5, obviously one of the twins, where Natalie is probably the toughest one to distinguish what exactly Natalie does in the game. I mean, Natalie seems to be a bit more aggressive of a personality than Adria, to where I think in the grand scheme of things, Natalie probably is a little bit worse socially than Adria, even though Natalie probably seemed to be maybe a little bit more level-headed strategically. But even then, I mean, they really were playing mostly the same game the entire time. There's not really that big of a difference between the two, to where, I mean, while they were targeted due to their physicality early on, I actually feel like they do pretty decent work in getting themselves in the Women's Alliance and also having the Twins Alliance on the side, while also convincing the Horsemen to keep them around. Again, there is a lot of impressive work there. But once they make the big move against Will, obviously their game is completely crumbled and they go out back to back. And also another difference here is the fact that Adria seemed to be better at comp, so at least that's something. So Natalie's here at number 168. Number 167, obviously you have Adria from BB5, who again, similar thing. I mean, pretty much the exact same game. Now I will give Adria a little bit more credit for, again, comp ability. She did seem to be better at comps, along the fact that I do believe Adria is the one that convinced Scott to keep her around. So again, that's pretty good. Outside that, again, just very similar game to Natalie, and obviously, like, in a way, worse from her HOH reign, where again she was the one that was actually HOH that made the astronomically bad move in getting rid of Will. That really sunk her game. But again, like, I think the Twins, while they play their end game very, very poorly, I think their first half of their game is actually like kind of strong, with them doing some pretty solid manipulation, where again, while like people were obviously annoyed by them using the Bible to manipulate, it is actually pretty effective at points. So where again, it keeps them off the block initially in week 3, and even when they are put on the block after the veto in week 3, they're still able to convince others to keep them around. So I think there's some pretty good work there, but also a really terrible endgame stretch where they just go on a massive power trip. So because that, she's here at 167. At 166, we're moving on to a player that I've given this person so many chances at this point. I mean, this is a person that has played 3 times, had so much potential each of those times, and never fully utilized it. We do have Devon, obviously from BB 17, 18, and 22. To where again, I think it's tough to really rank Devon much higher at this point, considering she's had 3 chances now. Again, she comes into BB 22 in particular in such a masterful position and just does not take advantage advantage of that in the slightest, or instead she just kind of finds herself kind of on the bottom and taken relatively deep into the game, but not really doing much in the game outside of obviously her winning the veto and saving Kevin, which was a big move, but it really doesn't gain her much in the game. Instead, actually makes her the next boot after that. Well, otherwise, I mean, again, BB17, she was targeted right away due to her conflicts with Clay and Shelly. I mean, BB18, it's a bit more solid of a game where she is in this more central position, though even then, she has this massive feud with Frank and Tiffany that gets her targeted. And really, I feel like just all of her games are games that just have so much wasted potential to the point where, again, I think at this point, it's just tough to really rank her that high considering how many opportunities she's really had. So because of that, for me, she's at 166. Now 165, we're moving on to a player that I think gets massively screwed over by a twist, though within that, again, there's still some good and some poor play, and that person is Nick Uhas from BB15. And again, Nick is someone that really ran week 1. I mean, he instantly forms the moving company, this big majority alliance. He really orchestrates a lot of what happens in that first week, being the charge against getting rid of David, though after that, it does go a bit downhill. And then week 2, it seemed like he was getting his way once again, only for him to then be put up by the MVP twist and proceed to get voted out, which is obviously very unfortunate. And definitely the thing that props him up is how twist screwed he was, though at the same time, I do think there are things to demerit from him. I mean, the fact that he really did not treat the other half of the house particularly well. He didn't really talk with them, which made it very clear that he was not on their side. Also, he does obviously come off as pretty threatening as well, where that's why he was put on the block as well, is because people thought of him as a really smart player, to where, and I think there is still that lack of threat management and his lack of bonding with the majority of the house that keeps him as low as he is here, despite how screwed over he was at 165. Now, 164, we're moving on to a player that was playing pretty well for first 3 weeks. Again, not flawless, but still a very impressive first 3 weeks of the game, only to be sniped out of the game, and that person is Amira from BB24. And again, Amira pretty much was running the show for first 3 weeks, to where she was in a really strong position, and after Paloma leaves, she really just takes control of her alliance, and again, was in a dominant position in the game. The problem is the fact that, again, she gets sniped out during the leftover formation week, though to be fair, even then, she was not the initial target. It was going to be Nicole. However, they worried about putting Taylor on the block again, where because that Amira was looked at as a more easy target, but they obviously need Taylor's vote, so they couldn't put her on the block, to where, again, Amira was just an easier target, kind of just due to circumstances there. But I do think there is a genuine criticism to have with Amira's game, and that is the fact that she was just so blatantly the person running the show, to where she was always being targeted by a lot of the men, mainly like Turner, Pooch, and Joseph, who were in the main core of what was going on, but did recognize that Amira was a really strong player and wasn't talking to them as much, to where, I think that is definitely a flaw. Again, like Nick, to where she just simply was not making bonds with people outside of her group as well as she should have, but still, again, was in a very dominant position in the game. Gets sniped out of the game due to kind of unforeseen circumstances. So again, for me, I do have her here at number 164. Now, 163, we're moving on to a player, again, kind of a similar thing. Also had a pretty good backing in the game. Then that person is Swaggy C from BB20, who, again, Swaggy, I think, is a competent player. I think he is one that, again, forms this initial majority alliance, had that initial majority alliance, very loyal to him outside of Caitlyn, I guess. Eventually, though, even then, Caitlyn seemed very loyal to him, at least in week 1, until Tyler was able to do what he did. And like, sure, again, like when it comes to Falte, I think that is a major aspect of me assessing their game, is the fact that, while yeah, they were made to look like idiots by the way that Tyler flipped the game on them, I still think you need a Tyler level player to flip the game on them. Where had Tyler not been there, I do not think the rest of level 6 would have been capable to do what they did. And simply straight up, were not able to do what he did. Sure, I do think Swaggy gets very unfortunate that he was on a cast with Tyler, someone that made that bold of a risk in week 1 and flipping over Caitlyn against Steve, which is just a really insane move. Or had that not been the case, again, I do think Swaggy would have been in a very strong spot in the game. While he was still the leader of his alliance and probably still the person that gets targeted had the other side won power, obviously if there wasn't a Tyler figure in the game, he would have just outright had more numbers, where he might not even go home if even on the block. So again, I think Swaggy is a person that had so much potential in the game, or his initial structure is one that is pretty impressive to see. It's just the fact that obviously gets crumbled by a truly elite player that we won't be talking about until very, very deep in this list. So because of the potential he had, for me, it's good enough to be here at 163. Now at 162, and we have a massive mixed bag of a player that I used to hold in relatively high regard until my latest rewatch of their season, to where I realized how bad they were. But I do have Marvin from BB5, and Marvin plays a really terrible game. I think Marvin is one that, again, plays from this like self-preservation based mindset of him playing as an individual in a game that, again, like, it's very difficult to play a game of Big Brother when you're alone, but he actively just seems to want to do that. And along the way also is terrible socially, where people just hated him, to where he was taken to 6 simply because there were other bigger targets on the board. And even then, again, like, makes a bad move at 7 by going after the Twins when they were a shield for him. I think had minimal win equity, not 0, but again, still not super likely. Now, again, I think the thing to really give him credit for is the creation of the back door, where, again, I do think I would credit him the most for the creation of the back door. But even then, I mean, he was really just on the bottom of the power structure the entire time. No one really wanted to work with him. He was always going to be just taken out eventually, to where unless he comped out the end, he had no chance of getting to the end, where, again, because of that, for me, he's here number 162. Now 161, pretty sloppy player here from BB21. We do have Nick Macarone, who, again, I think is a player that, again, had moments for sure. I mean, initially he was in the majority group. He obviously loses traction in the game, though was able to kind of recover from that and pick allies back up, only for him to then be looked at as a big target again and eventually take it out. Like, it's very much a mixed bag of a game, but it's one where he definitely had a lot of agency in the game. At least there's that. But again, it was just kind of in and out of the majority group, along with the fact that he just, like, completely loses control at Final 9, to where Annalise is, like, taken out simply just due to her connection to him, and then he's taken out the following week. Again, the end of his game is definitely pretty bad, along with the fact that, again, he gets flipped on in week 3 and loses Bella. Like, his HOH in particular is a particularly bad one. But again, there were more points where he was in the majority and had some agency in the game, to where, as a whole, I don't look at him as a good player, but it's enough to be here number 161. But there we go. I mean, that is part 2 of my ranking of every Big Brother player. Now, obviously, expect part 3 in the very near future. We'll go through numbers 160 to 81. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.